At the age of 17, I joined the Royal Australian Navy in September 1942 and went to Flinders Naval Depot. Was there for 5 months. The first month I remember was learning that the floor wasn't the floor, it was a deck, and that the ceiling wasn't the ceiling, it was a bulkhead, and that the left was port and the right was starboard and all that sort of thing. Everything that moved you saluted, and if it was still you polished it, I was told. And then the next 4 months I was a visual signalman. That's hoisting flags, semaphore and Morse code by light. And I was posted to HMAS Australia, which was our biggest ship. It was the flagship, which meant that it had the Admiral in charge of the whole fleet. It was a ship with a crew of 950. I can remember going up that gangway with great trepidation, not knowing what was ahead of me, not knowing anyone on board, and being an 18-year-old, perhaps only travelled across the river to Moama before I went there. And that was my home for the next 4 years plus. We travelled right around the south of Tasmania at very high speed because there were a lot of Japanese submarines around at that stage. There were approximately 30 ships either sunk or damaged by submarine attack along our east coast during those first couple of years of the war. All the gear to hear them, etc., wasn't on big ships like ours, they were on destroyers, which were smaller ones. We had no means of fighting them unless they were on the surface. We thought there was a submarine, we'd turn around and go as fast as we could. Then in 1944, we were part of the American 7th Fleet virtually, and we covered all the landings along the northern New Guinea coast. Because at that stage our fellows were, they were holding Kokoda and those places and parts of New Guinea, but generally all the soldiers were American troops. Our job really was to clear the airways, clear the seaways and bombard the beaches before they landed, and if they had any problems, lob a few more where the enemy was. The 21st of October was quite a day in the history of the Australian Navy because the flagship HMAS Australia was hit by a suicide plane. The signal deck was right at the rear of the mast, so the plane hit and then it fell forward, and many were killed, many wounded, fires and extensive damage. So that was our first hit by the Kamakazes. But I think at that age you feel a bit nothing's going to happen to you, and it'd be wrong to say you didn't get frightened. I think anyone would be crazy to say that, but I think quite often you were frightened to show you were frightened in that situation with all your mates and everyone around you. And then what followed was the biggest naval battle. You hear about Jutland and you hear about the battle at Trafalgar and all the rest, but they just dwarf into insignificance the size of the Battle of 80 when the whole Japanese fleet and the American fleet. The Japanese Navy was finished after that. The Brits had their own flag signalling and the Americans had theirs. We went through Flinders and learnt all about the Brits, and then immediately go to a ship, and semaphore and Morse code was the same, but the flags were different because radio silence. When we sailed all that way to Lady Gulf, that took the week, there was no radio signals, of course. It was all by flags. You'd signal what was going to happen through the night, like at 11 o'clock, the ships might have to turn to port or to starboard, and the Admiral would hoist what was to happen. Got into real trouble if you ever put the wrong flag on. It was the greatest sin a signalman could do. And discipline was fair but very firm in those days. If you turned the whole fleet the wrong way, you might have finished up in the boob, but none of us ever did that. And the next landing was to be on the western side of the island of Luzon, north of Manila, at a place called Lingayen Gulf. We were a bit ahead of the landing ships because we were going up to clear the seaways and the airways and bombard the beaches, etc. I think the Japanese had lost about 400 kamikaze planes in that era, and 5 of them hit our ship. It was more than most ships anyway. A lot of damage, of course, a lot of loss of life and many wounded. And that was really quite a frightening experience. I mean, bombs, you might see them and you'd reckon you're going to dodge those, but once a plane got you in his sights, you knew he was going to hit you. You know, they virtually gave up bombing, or they were all trying to do it. I was in Sydney at the time, and I can just remember the tremendous relief when they dropped those couple of bombs that, we wouldn't have to go up there again. I think I've been brought up to believe that our leaders are the ones who know these things, and you just accept it, right or wrong, and you support it. We're talking about a different era altogether, aren't we? And we're talking about when our country, my era, our country was at its greatest peril. The Japanese had overrun from the Philippines and New Guinea, and there were 63 air raids on Darwin. There were submarines in Sydney Harbour. There were rationing of food, clothing and fuel, and air raid shelters in backyards and sandbags around major buildings, and it was a different era altogether. We had 1 million of our 7 million in the services, and our country was never been anything like the peril we're at. 4 hours on shift and might have 8 hours off, and you'd have to go to action stations at dawn and dusk every day, and they say sailors slept in hammocks. Well, we had hammocks, but we'd sleep on the deck on a flag or something. And we lived in an area so small and just so close and depended so much on one another. I don't think that you ever go through life and find the same sort of friendship and dependability on one another as you do in that sort of situation. I was pleased to go, and I was pleased I went, and I was pleased to get home. I just accept what happened. It was, I think I'm rather fortunate with my lot.